Okay, hi. In this video I'm going to just quickly run through some of my thoughts on strategy in Balance of Powers by Compass Games. It's a bit of a brain dump really. I played it a few times and there's some very interesting sort of decision points which you get to in the game. I generally play it with just the two main maps, North map, South map, but these thoughts would apply equally to the full game if you're playing with the Ottoman map and with the naval game, because we're focusing mainly on what happens in the land war, which is the critical part of the game. So let's start with looking at the initial invasion, the opening turns for the Central Powers. So I tend to start with a historical Schlieffen plan through Belgium. So the forts of Liège and Namur will fall to the siege guns. There's one element of siege guns in the initial invading army, so they can make short work of these two. The first decision point for the Germans really is whether to continue down into Maubeuge with the guns or to divert up to Antwerp. There's pros and cons of both. You take Antwerp, you've now conquered Belgium, you'll now start to gain the 1 RP for Belgium. Until that point, if you've got the capital and the Entente control Antwerp, then neither side will gain the RP. It may only sound like 1 RP, but this is every season, so RPs are really quite precious in the game. However, if you divert your siege guns to Antwerp, the chances are there'll be at least one entrenched Belgian corps in there. So if you can't get a breakthrough and you end up having to entrench your attacking force, which would include the guns, then it'll make their extraction and redeployment slower. Maybe back into France to take on Maubeuge. Or you come down to Maubeuge, take out Maubeuge before the French can get there in any great numbers, because they're essentially deployed for the Plan 17 offensive, and the BEF have not got enough forces to hold from the coastline through the marshes all the way down to Maubeuge. So if you can take it early, it's tempting, but then you're going to get Antwerp late, so there's an interesting dilemma for you. The next decision point really for Central Powers is, when do we send our guns east? I've had one game where the Central Powers decided to more or less ignore Russia, certainly with the German forces, and paid the price, because the big bear got uncaged in the end and just really ran riot through the Carpathians. Was never held in check by the Central Powers. So I don't think you can do that. At some point you need to commit to the east, and brings you over to the east part of the map, and then you've got some more interesting choices. Do you try and drive on Kovno? This has got the potential danger of being flanked from either the Russian forces deployed here or coming up from Warsaw, so that you've got these two pinch points. Depends how the Russians deploy, of course. Maybe more tempting is to drive on Warsaw, and you've got a couple of routes into Warsaw. Novo Georgievsk, I think it is. Can't quite read it from here. We've got Warsaw and Lomza, so there's 3 black forts in a bit of a cluster. And don't forget, these are non-frontier forts, so each one will cost the Russians 1 point of demoralisation, which essentially is 1 RP loss for every seasonal turn. So there is an incentive to get in there early. Warsaw falling opens up Ivangorod as another target, and eventually on to Lutsk. So this is a tempting drive, or you could potentially go up towards Grodno and get to Kovno that way. The Russians are on 16 crisis points, and there are only 8 forts. So to get them to crisis, you've got to get all 8, plus have 8 devastating battles where the Russians lose a point of demoralisation. So you need to press hard to get that. You want to be knocking Russia out of the war as soon as you can, so you can divert resources back to the south and to the west. The Austrians have got some interesting choices too, because the Russians will be pushing hard, and the Russian options are to try and go against the Germans, depending what they commit to the east. That could be pretty tough. Or they can try and hit the weaker partner in the initial 2 Central Powers, which is Austria-Hungary. There's 3 population centres here: Wawaruska, Brody and Tarnopol. They should be looking to pick up those 3. Again, those 3 together will earn them 1 RP, in the same way that the Germans are trying to pick up at least 3 population centres in France before they divert stuff to the east. If you can get 6, great, but 6 is quite tough. So they should be getting at least these 3 here and trying to put pressure on the Austrians. If you don't do that, if you don't at least get a couple of points of demoralisation off the Austrians, you're giving them the free rein to support the Germans later in the war and to take some of the demoralisation points from the Germans onto their own crisis level, because you can have shared stacks in the game, so they can spare troops to stack with the Germans, and if the attackers get a good roll and they demoralise the defender, then the Austrians can take some of the heat off the Germans. So it's important to try and squeeze them early, to not give them that option. And the Russians are really just playing a waiting game. They are going to collapse. I mean, the last game, I think we got to a full revolution in February 1917, which is a bit early. They really want to make the Central Powers still to work throughout all of 1916 and into 1917, if at all possible, to delay the freedom it gives the Central Powers to divert resources elsewhere. Just come down to try and position the... Okay, so we're looking at the Balkans now. So early on in the game, the Allies need to land at Salonika to get a core into a southern map Central Power country, which could be Austria-Hungary or potentially Bulgaria if they've joined the war. So the Ottomans are trying to get Bulgaria in, which allows them access to Salonika and to get through to Belgrade. And equally the Allies are trying to push up from Salonika to get to Belgrade to support it, and also to get into Austria to essentially give them influence to persuade Italy to join the war. Until you've done that, Italy could go either way. You need to show some presence in a Central Powers country on the southern map to increase your chances of getting Italy on your side and not allow them to go Central Powers. These hexes are pretty key. Mountain hexes, easy to defend. The Bulgarians are quite good defensively. The Entente supply has got to go to a port. It can't use a minor power supply source, so keeping this route open is very important for the Entente. You really don't want to allow the Central Powers to break through here and to be able again to support maybe the Italian front or somewhere else with their troops. You really want to tie them up. And then Italy itself, it's a tough one to make much progress on. It's tough terrain, good Austrian forts. Doesn't take many troops in the deployed in the front line to hold this area, but Italy can make some progress with some infrastructure, potentially some air later on, and it just keeps the Austrians honest. They have to have some troops down here, and maybe you can ship some Italians into Serbia, or maybe to the Western Front if you have any spare troops. I guess the Central Powers' only realistic objective is to capture Venice, which is a victory point. Hex. Once they've done that, that's kind of job done really. Trying to knock Italy out of the war is pretty tough. Trying to get through the mountains into Rome can be expensive. So, back where we started, France. This is probably going to bog down to a reasonably historical position. If you can get 6 population centres, that's great. I mean, maybe Calais, Boulogne, Lille, Maubeuge, either Nancy or Longwy. 6 is great. 9 is probably too much to hope for. But 6 will give you an extra 2 RPs every season, and you're picking up another one for Belgium. So that's all going into the German coffers. French need to hang on. Don't give up too much ground. Make the Germans work for every hex. The British will eventually feed in. They'll get the good core. The Beth early can launch some reasonable counterattacks, and later on you've got the Canadians and the Anzac Corps, which can come in and give the Germans a few concerns. And it all builds really to 1916, sort of spring or later, when the Somme offensive starts to pick up, and finally the Entente start to get some siege gun assets, and the swings in the air war start to go back in their favour. I've had friends that have said, oh, you know, the air war's a bit of a nonsense, why not just have a few random DRMs, but to me that misses the point. I mean, I like the way that the air superiority goes one way and then the other. The Iron Deckers come along to take it away from the weaker level 2 Entente aircraft, and then they come in 1916 and they really rule the roost, and then the Red Baron with the Albatross aircraft come in at the end of 1916 and they take back the initiative for a while, and then it swings again in 1917 with the better Allied aircraft. That's a nice part of the game in my mind, and then it's all to play for. It's all about these bargaining chip hexes, which you've got to try and capture. House rules have got the additional potential VPs for a late American entry, which encourages more of a historical play to get the Americans in. Then you're going to get maybe a couple of points for Africa, one for the Crisis of July, and I think you need more than 12 to win as the Entente. So there's lots to think about. I think it gives a nice feel for the overall campaigns. They're sort of multiple campaigns within the same game, but lots of tough choices. You know, where do I need to deploy my scarce resources for the biggest effect? Hope that's been of some use, just to look at some of the strategic choices in Balance of Powers.